Turkey's presidential election might not be until 2028, but there is already political turmoil in the streets, with over 1,000 protesters arrested after voicing their dissent following the arrest and the jailing of Istanbul's Mayor Ekrem Imamoglu. Imamoglu is seen as the main political rival to the current president, President Erdogan, and many claim that his arrest was politically motivated. That is something that the president denies. Now, joining me to discuss all of this is Dr Ziya Meral, who is a Middle East expert. Doctor, I wonder if you could begin by telling us what's going through your minds as you see these protests on the streets of Istanbul growing night after night, the passion, the anger. You know, what do you feel, and where does this go next?
I mean, I think sadness is the shortest way I can explain that. For the last few months, we have seen positive signs in the recovery of Turkish economy. We have seen a new kind of possibility of a better relationship between Europe and Turkey. We have seen the fall of Assad regime in the south. We have seen reports of a potential peace breakthrough between Turkey and the outlawed terror group PKK. I was getting quite optimistic. So the developments, even though they've always been on the cards as a possibility that the main opposition party, if not Imamoglu himself, was going to face pressure in lead up to the elections, I don't think any of us thought this is that immediate as a dynamic. And then to see the Turkish lira crumble, to Turkish stock market lose almost 20% or so, and all the good work, economic restoration is now crumbling again, and people rightfully feeling frustrated. They feel like this is a political maneuver rather than a legal process. That is sad, because the world at the moment is going through fierce chaos, and all of it affects Turkey. And to see Turkey and Turkish government, pursuing policies and such social instability, well, that's really not good for anybody.
It feels like, when you look at some of these pictures, would you agree? The big protests in the center of Istanbul, some of them outside the office of the mayor, the arrested mayor himself. It feels like it's possible that we're looking at the future of this country being rewritten right there on the streets.
It's a difficult one to forecast. Obviously, Turkey is no stranger to white protests. We had that during, again, in 2013 onwards in Istanbul against President Erdogan. Throughout Turkish history, there have always been protests. But this is a very unique one for so many reasons. A mayor, again, being now taken to court really reminds us to events in 1996, 1997, which actually led to President Erdogan, who was then the mayor of Istanbul, went to jail for, again, political reasons, and out of that he came out, and a new political momentum got behind him, and he eventually ended up as the president. So that's why, some people are now saying this is basically the start of the end of Turkish democracy as we know it, and other people are saying, well, this is start and the end of President Erdogan era, who's been in power for more than 20 years, because this imprisoned mayor is actually inevitably, sooner or later, going to give birth to a new political momentum to oust him. Maybe the truth is right in the middle, right? I think next few years is definitely going to be precarious in the country, economically, politically. I think it will be unstable. We are already seeing a large number of highly qualified Turks wanting to leave the country. EU has been taking some positive steps towards kind of repairing some of the relations with Turkey. For the last few years, it's been at a breaking level. But now, again, the events of this weekend, again, is going to pull them back from pursuing any kind of proactive agenda with Turkey. And that will affect the average Turkish citizen directly, economically, socially, and politically.
Yeah, and we've talked about the economics, the politics, the social, but this is about democracy, right? This is about the constitution. Let's thought experiment. Where on that spectrum from democracy towards autocracy does Turkey in its current form this week sit?
Yeah, it's a difficult one on a scale to 1 to 10. It's very difficult to give a number to it. Election processes in Turkey have held their integrity, even though they were not really fully free or fully fair. We could still rely on the outcomes of the elections in Turkey. So that's why some people have said use the word competitive authoritarianism. In other words, election still matters in Turkey, but the
Yeah.
government has
And
a lot of
just
power
to
and
explain what you mean by that, that concept is that there are elections that are fair, but the influence around it is what is unfair and
yeah,
skews voters one way or
yeah.
another.
Well, elections are reliable. In other words, the voting process has integrity, and more than 80% of Turks often go to ballot box, which is quite high. If you think about the percentage of voters, even in the UK, is 50-60% at best in most elections that we see. However, it's not fully fair because obviously the government party enjoys control and influence over all the official state channels as well as resources, and not nor fully free because you had again political figures facing jail time or in some neighborhoods in some areas in difficulties, particularly with Kurdish politicians facing limitations. But by and large, even OECD, held this kind of view that they still reflected the national desire. In other words, President Erdogan has been in power. His party has been in power legitimately by gaining more than half of the votes in the country. The last election, however, has seen a substantial drop in his votes and his parties. And Imamoglu, the politician who's now facing charges, is in detention and now might be imprisoned if he's found guilty of corruption. Charges brought against him. He has kind of shown the signs that actually the main opposition party is really gaining huge grounds. And Erdogan's party losing the mayorship of Istanbul was a huge kind of blow because when Erdogan was again himself a mayor or running to be mayor, he often said, if you win Istanbul, you will win the national elections in Turkey.
Yeah,
So now fast forward,
a,
20 plus
a
years.
statement which
Now
might
he
come back
lost
to haunt him, right?
it.
Yeah, and let's just touch on this. This figure who is to so many people, particularly in sort of urban areas, in the cities, he is the resistance. Whether or not they like him, he presents the greatest threat to Erdogan's time in power. And so just explain the appeal of him as a politician and as a personality as well.
Yeah. Well, obviously, Imamoglu again has this very kind of charming connection with the voters. He comes across as man of the people. He's quite warm and he's quite witty. He's been able to connect with different segments of the voters and kind of signal moving on from the traditional politics of the opposition party, which a lot of religious Turks or even Kurdish voters have kind of seen as, reaction against themselves. So he's able to build bridges and he's able to kind of hold his nerves in highly stressful moments and focus on the organization of his party. So I think that's what made him quite kind of a political threat for President Erdogan. And last weekend, when CHP, the opposition party, held some sort of symbolic vote that opened up to people outside of their party membership too, some of the estimates said more than 10 million people in Istanbul and across the country have went to this kind of voluntary kind of expression of support and voted for him to be the presidential candidate. That is a substantial amount of votes. So in other words, if he's able to pass through this kind of hurdle in the courts and is not denied a chance to run in the elections, I think there would be a very kind of comfortable sense that we could state now that he will be the next president of the country, which again, of course, will be a very turbulent process in lead up to it and after that.
And of course, this is a national story in Turkey, to many a national crisis, but in a sense, this is global too. Like, just tell me how this all fits in, because you're going to have European leaders like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron who want Erdogan to be part of their sort of coalition of the willing inside Ukraine. You've got Erdogan who wants some of that defense cash. There's money that's being spent on building defense industries around Europe. How does all of that affect what's happening on the streets in Istanbul and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not just the defense cash. I mean, Turkey at the moment, for example, is Turkish Navy alone is building 31 above and underwater vessels in a single year, including an aircraft carrier, submarines, and frigates. You know, the remarkable industrial defense industrial base, which we don't have in most countries in Europe, including in UK to a certain level. So that's why engaging with Turkey geopolitically always mattered to NATO and to Europe and to UK. Because if you want to develop a policy against Russia, you need Turkish alliance, right? Because of the Black Sea, critical straits, and all this kind of complex relationships. And President Erdogan, for all of his shortcomings, he's been quite vocal in his support to Ukraine. In fact, shortly after Zelensky's trip to DC, he was in Ankara. He was welcomed with a a really big state welcome. And Erdogan clearly said, actually, Ukraine should join NATO. It belongs in NATO, and so they're quite supportive of Ukraine. So the events of the last weekend obviously have given anxiety and led some to give a pause of the conversations we had for the last 3-4 weeks or a couple of months on a new kind of European defense and security infrastructure and how Turkey would fit in. That might very well be one of the calculations for President Erdogan, thinking, well, at the moment there's a positive momentum in Europe towards working with Turkey. Obviously, President Trump and his administration in the United States really don't have an issue with domestic developments, and he quite seems to like President Erdogan as a person too. So maybe that's why they thought this is a good time if you're going to do this kind of shaping political maneuvers for the elections to come. This is the right time to do. But I think it's a short-term kind of perspective. I think it did limit some of the excitement towards Turkey, some of the economic developments, which was again attracting foreign direct investment into the country for the last 3 weeks. Turkish Stock Exchange was again seeing signs of a good kind of recovery. At the moment, they all seem to have stalled. I think a lot of actors in Europe, even though they've stated publicly about their concerns, are still kind of waiting to see where the dust will settle about these kind of developments before they assess the long-term outcome or where things might go, which is probably the wisest diplomatic kind of attitude to take at the moment.
And of course, a crucial change has been in the White House, sort of almost silence. Like, perhaps previous presidents might have kind of expressed some sort of concerns or condemnation. Like, would this arrest, in your view, have happened had Donald Trump not been elected last November?
Yeah. It's a difficult one, obviously, to argue what would have happened if not. However, President Biden, for example, didn't really invite President Erdogan to White House, didn't even reach out to call him, and often gave kind of cold shoulders to engagement with him.
They were frenemies, weren't they, really?
They were. And also during Biden years, the Turkish-American relations were deteriorating substantially. A lot of the Biden administration did not really see Turkey as even a partner nation. In fact, when Turkey purchased the Russian missiles and lost kind of place in the F-35 jet project, with Donald Trump, it's a bit different because now again we're back to a US foreign policy that isn't really institutional, but again it's personalized through the tweets of a president or his personal likes and dislikes. And clearly President Erdogan is the type of world leader that Donald Trump likes, right? A strong leader who can negotiate and who can do give and take and actually get on with it. And I think that kind of wins an appeal with the Trump administration. And again, Turkish stand on Ukraine, Turkish stand on the Middle East is a lot closer to Europe, ironically. So that's why I think inevitably Turkey cannot necessarily fully go with a US solution on Ukraine because that's actually not really a solution. It's only a temporary kind of pause that will benefit Russia. Turkey is quite kind of committed to support Ukraine and would want to be part of the coalition of the willing championed by UK and France. So how Turkey is going to negotiate that with US will be interesting. But again, Donald Trump, last couple of days said he doesn't actually have a problem thinking about maybe selling F-35 jets back again to Turkey, if and only if Turkey kind of dismantles some of the Russian missiles it bought and etc. So at the moment, things are quiet on US-Turkey relations front. Maybe, like you hinted, maybe that has been read as an opportunist time by those decision makers in Ankara.
Well, we're going to be watching closely. It feels like these events in Istanbul could be potentially very consequential So Dr. Ziya Meral, thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you.